Alma by wandering around that pathetic ruin. The reason is that much of it is right here in this room today, in your friendships and common memories, in the remembered experiences you have shared with your friends, your spouses, your children, and your grandchildren. That Alma will be around for a very long time, and no doubt grow in the telling to those rarefied heights that only the truest tall tales can attain. I can attest to that personally. Last spring, on the ferry from Vancouver to Victoria, the University of Victoria prof complimented my wife on the new green shoes given her by our daughter. It turned out his mother had attended Alma in the 40s and 50s. We spent the next 20 minutes exchanging Alma stories. I'm here today to add my own memories to that evolving, intricately branching narrative to describe what were in fact the strangest 11 years of my life. They began in deep sadness with the unexpected death of my father in 1950 at the age of 44. A year later, my mother, Flora Mooney-Sifton, and I arrived at Alma to occupy the principal's apartment at the end of the main hall. We were both wrecks. There is a picture of us at that time, and it's right over there in Susan Butlin's recent book. My mother's face wears a hopeful but achingly fragile smile, and my 6-year-old self is grinning like a berserk hyena, which is what I still do when I'm completely freaked out. There was good reason for these expressions. Except for supply teaching and volunteer activity, my mother hadn't worked since the late 1930s, when she married my father. Worse, she still missed him terribly. During that period, she spoke to me many times about a vivid, almost hallucinatory sense of my father's presence beside her. I can only imagine what she was going through. As for me, I felt like I'd been kicked out of paradise and run through a Cuisinart to land as a shower of pureed psyche on Mars. For my first years at Alma, I had terrible nightmares, the kind that would send me screaming in my sleep out of our apartment and all the way up the main stairs to the college's second floor in my sleep, or cause me to bolt howling and unconscious outside and halfway across the lawn towards the LNVS tracks. Fortunately, over time, Alma healed us both. For my mother, the college provided an all-consuming responsibility for 75 and ultimately 175 girls and their teachers, as well as all the administrative staff, maintenance people, cleaners, cooks, handymen, and gardeners required to keep that ancient building, amphitheater, and campus functioning, habitable, and beautiful. She usually worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Soon, she didn't have time to grieve. More important, her involvement with Alma was a little like being married again. Most important of all, she rediscovered a passion. I'll go into that a bit more later. As for me, I slowly began to realize that when I came to Alma, I hadn't crashed on Mars, but made an emergency landing on Venus. Not, mind you, the astronomers overheated Venus with its runaway greenhouse effect, though a little later it sometimes felt that way. No, my Venus had 14-foot ceilings, tall Gothic windows, flying buttresses, towers, secret passages and stairways, a ghost, a gown of oriole-filled vines, a Greek amphitheater, a gym, a pool, tennis courts, a deep winding ravine, an art studio complete with statues of near-naked Greeks, characters of amazing eccentricity and kindness, and last, but certainly not least, girls, and more girls, everywhere, all wearing red blazers, like Mounties, to my very conventional boyish imagination. This Venus was never silent. The building was always sighing and creaking and filled with giggling, whispering, gossiping, squealing, laughing, tortured and occasionally mellifluous violin strains, a few screams and howls, the clattering of Oxfords and high heels, endlessly repeated scales on the piano, the scratching of pens, organ music, singing, and sometimes, very late at night, the sound of a melancholy girl sobbing for home. Living on Venus definitely required some adjustments. In my first few years, I ate downstairs at one of the staff tables in the main dining room, the one in the basement. In my search for congenial company, I often switched tables 2 or 3 times in the course of a meal. But my table manners as a 6-year-old were definitely not up to Venusian standards. My aunt, Jean Mooney, who'd eventually become a phys ed teacher at Alma and then operator of the DIP, described to me how every time I switched tables, 3 times on that particular occasion, a very fastidious music teacher would move to another table. She was unable to get her dinner down while watching me chew with my mouth open. Soon after, I started dining in our apartment on food sent up on a tray from the college kitchen, blissfully chewing with my mouth open. My wife assures me my table manners have finally improved. There was also great kindness on my Venus. Alma's Japanese jack-of-all-trades, Harry Nishimoto, helped incompetent me to build a birdhouse for a manual training course. His wife gave me a taste for sushi, which I've never lost. And one day on the way back from school, I happened to pass through the college kitchen on the way up to our apartment. Dorothy, the pastry cook, gave me a tiny bag of freshly baked oatmeal cookies. They were delicious. Her bakery soon became a regular after-school stop. For small boys, heaven may well be a good pastry cook in the basement. To put it briefly, I was made to feel so special in those early years at Alma that I soon forgot to mourn my father or remember the paradise I left behind. It was a strange, unreal existence, though. Imagine the son of the Lady of the Lake in an Arthurian legend populated only by women. Or little Lord Fauntleroy in the realm of the great goddess, whose identity could, of course, vary depending upon one's theology. It was very weird and very wonderful. And then, as I entered high school at the precocious age of 11, I became aware of Venus's other face. As some of you here likely know, my mother could be dauntingly perceptive, even precognitive. If you return to the place in your mind where you'd hidden some shameful secret, you'd often find her there looking out at you with a knowing, but not always unsympathetic expression. On this particular occasion, when she called me aside in our living room for a serious talk, I didn't, for a change, have some shameful secret to hide. I still didn't know whom she'd spoken to or what had happened, but her expression was very grim as she told me, flat out, that if I ever messed with a college girl, I'd be packed off to Ridley College or some other similarly militaristic private school. It would all happen so fast, my head would still be spinning by the time Ridley's front doors closed behind me with a metallic crash, like the gates of Canada's now retired Kingston Penitentiary. I took her very seriously, even though my interest in girls at that point was still more theoretical than practical. I was impressed because, to me, the threat sounded like exile to my earlier nightmare of Mars, away from the pleasant, if rather baffling, Venus I'd made my emergency landing on. And let me tell you, Mars had no appeal. At the Central Elgin Collegiate Institute, where I went to high school, every able-bodied grade 9 male was conscripted into the cadets to become comfortable with rifles, grow to love spit and polish, and learn how to march in formation. These were not my strong suits. Like any good Venusian male, I hated hierarchy, viewed firearms with suspicion, was congenitally untidy, and couldn't tell my left from my right. When the sergeant hollered right turn, I turned left. I was the good soldier Schweik, Yossarian, and Gomer Pyle rolled into one. Anti-Vietnam protests would soon come naturally to me. I couldn't breathe the air on Mars. This reality posed something of a dilemma for me, because as the year progressed, my interest in girls grew from abstraction to obsession. As any of you who've raised teenage boys will know, the Y chromosome produces at puberty a wonderfully narrow tunnel vision when it comes to certain objects. And in contrast to my schoolmates at the collegiate, there were about 175 of those objects cluttering up the house where I lived. On Sundays, I heard nylon stockings slithering against each other everywhere I went. When I left our apartment for a breath of fresh air, I found myself walking down the main concourse on the planet of girls. It was exhilarating and perplexing, since I had no desire to spend my adolescence screwing up cadet drills on Mars. Then there was the issue of the leftovers. My mother's term for any St. Thomas youth who was so unappealing to local girls, he wanted to date an Alma girl. I was kind of a leftover to the power of 10. In my overheated state, I could hardly see a St. Thomas girl for the forest of college women just outside our apartment door. By the time I'd finished grade 10, I'd earned my doctorate in sexual longing. To make matters worse, all my male peers at high school assumed I was living in a harem. They sidle up beside me, leer lewdly, and ask, "How much you getting, John?" It was impossible to say 0, and then explain about the dread of exile to Mars. I took to smiling mysteriously or rolling my eyes heavenward in hope of some divine intervention, preferably by a sympathetic moon goddess. I did eventually go out with some Alma girls, though only after an orthodontist had wired my teeth with razor wire so that my mouth looked a little like the outer perimeter of Guantanamo Bay. These were sad, underwhelming affairs, with both me and my date too rattled and self-conscious even to hold a decent conversation, let alone do anything that would worry the rulers of Venus. Still, on at least one occasion, I managed to bring my date home well after curfew, only to be greeted at the main doors by my mother in high dudgeon as lightning bolts crashed around my head, no doubt hurled down by the furies lurking in the sprinkler system hidden behind those 14-foot ceilings. But it would be unfair to reduce my teen years at Alma to a tale of sexual frustration. There were also the pool, the tennis courts, and the gym where I played basketball at every opportunity. There was the rich pageantry of candle lighting, May Day, and performances of Midsummer Night's Dream in the amphitheater, which, to my mythology-soaked mind, always contained enticing pagan overtones. There was the goldfish pond among the flowers below my bedroom window, which always looked so serene, I sometimes wondered if heaven weren't a cool underwater environment filled with gold-finned and thoroughly feminine angels. But most of all, there was the great old Gothic structure itself, with its sighs and creaks, its ghost, its busy kitchen, the humid rumble of its subterranean laundry, its endless labyrinth of stairs and corridors, all filled with what, for me, then, was the enigmatic but thoroughly embodied and enchanting hum of female voices. This was my world, a sanctuary of wonder and gentle mystery, of puppy love and adolescent despair, of absurdity and wild humor so zany it's still difficult to explain to anyone who never lived there. My Venus had Hogwarts be all hollow. And if we carry our childhood with us, then at some level, I never left. In the real world, though, I departed from Alma for university in September of 1962. But those 11 years at Alma had shaped me. They were milestones in my journey out of the very dark place I found myself in after my father's death. They gave me a sense of the wonder, absurdity, pain, and mystery of the world that has sustained my imagination ever since. And perhaps most of all, they gave me the opportunity to see my mother's passion, which found its fullest expression in the way Alma flourished during her tenure there. What was that passion? Well, to understand it, you have to appreciate that my mother, when she was growing up, read novels by the great Western Canadian feminist Nellie McClung. Also, while charming, graceful, and sympathetic, my mother was definitely not a sentimentalist. She was too psychologically acute for that. She possessed a generous, wide-ranging intellect and a practical view of the world. More to the point, she had herself found a kind of fulfillment in her job at Alma that she knew she would have never experienced in her marriage to my father, however happy it may have been. Though raised and educated in the first half of the 20th century, she didn't believe Alma's role was just to give young women the social graces they needed to become ornamental, or perhaps trophy, wives for well-heeled guys. She didn't hate men or think of marriage as a death trap for women, but she did believe that every young woman should be equipped to choose her own path through life, whether this involved marriage, a career, both, or perhaps something new and entirely different. To this end, Flora was, right from the start, determined to raise Alma's academic standards. While she recognized the value of commercial, home ec, visual arts, dance, drama, and music, she believed Alma graduates shouldn't have their ambitions limited by lack of a strong academic program. For her, a successful career as a teacher, an academic, a public servant, a business person, or an artist was just as valid a goal as a good marriage. And for her, everyone was equal. She believed stereotypes about gender, culture, race, or religion shouldn't exclude any young woman from finding the life she needed. To this end, Flora, throughout her years at Alma, struggled to impart to all her students a sense of optimism and self-worth, a belief that they could actually get what they needed from life, whatever that might be. Yet, though she admired achievement, I doubt she'd have taken today's I'm all right Jill female CEOs, or those stainless steel blondes who seem to be spokespersons these days for the Conservative Party. For her, it wasn't enough for a civilized person to be financially successful or powerful or even exhibit religious piety. She also had to be intellectually alive, culturally aware, and above all, seriously engaged with some larger community, especially with its most socially and economically disadvantaged members. The practical exercise of compassion was always as important to her as success. Religious commitment had to involve good works. She believed only a social conscience could give meaning to ambition. This inclusive, empathic ideal is even more relevant today in our shrunken, viciously competitive world. Especially, I might add, for boys. Thank you very much.